Hey everyone, Sariel here. Welcome to the Forgotten Empire's guide to the Stone Guard in Mogu'shan Vaults on 10-man normal. Now this guide is based on live information, so not on the beta, but it is still very fresh content, so what's in this guide may change in the near future. Okay, so in this guide I'll try and cover the entire fight in as much detail as I can, but as it's just been released, things might get changed, removed, added, so I'll make a note of any changes or updates to the fight, and you'll find those in the description below. So here's a list of what's in this guide. So we'll start with who are the Stone Guard, and then what can they do, what abilities they have. We'll look then at the environment and positioning of the raid, so where we stand, what we need to be aware of, then the tactics for the entire fight end to end, and we'll finish the video off with anything else that seems important. Okay, so Stone Guard. They're 4 big stone Quillen, or Quillen, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, so I'll stick with Quillen. Big stone dogs. Each one's named after an element or a mineral, so there's the Jade Guardian, the Jasper Guardian, the Amethyst Guardian, and the Cobalt Guardian. All 4 are almost all the same. They each have 5 abilities, 4 of which are shared, but they have one unique one per Guardian, and we'll cover those later. Although there are 4 of them, we only ever fight 3 at a time, so those of you that have raided Bastion of Twilight might remember the Halfus Wormbreaker fight. Each week it was random which 3 packs of trash or which 3 extra adds you'd fight along with the boss. Same sort of thing here, every weekly reset, a different one of the 4 Guardians is benched, not part of the fight. Now, as I said, they're almost all the same mob interchangeably, so it doesn't matter massively which one is benched, and it doesn't really make a huge difference on how you approach the fight. But one of the main things that makes them unique is that they're all elemental, and they all attack with a different element. So the Jade Guardian uses nature damage, the Jasper uses fire, Amethyst is shadow, and Cobalt is arcane. All 3 bosses share a health pool, so if one dies, they all die. GG, we're done. So for that reason, for a lot of the fight, it's good to be cleaving on the boss you're fighting, so you're hitting more than one of the Guardians at once. But again, more on that later. So, let's talk abilities. How exactly can they fuck us up? Like I said, they all have 5 separate abilities, but 4 of those are shared, so all 3 Guardians can do them, with a slight variation depending on the element of the Guardian in question. So, the first of the abilities that are shared is Rend Flesh, and that is a standard 15-second dot applied to the tanks, which causes about 36k damage every second for that duration. It just needs to be healed through. The second shared ability is more of a passive thing, and it's only applied to the bosses under certain conditions. That's called Stone Skin, and what that does is when any of the bosses are more than 12 yards away from any of their homies, the damage they take is reduced by 90%. There is a second aspect to Stone Skin though. If you look at any of the bosses, you'll notice that they've all got an energy bar from 1 to 100. And that energy is a major part of the 4th shared ability, which I'll cover in a minute. But whenever Stone Skin is active, in addition to not taking as much damage, they also don't regenerate energy. The third ability they all share is kind of different depending on which boss is using it, and that's called Petrification. Throughout the fight, only one of the bosses will be casting this at a time, but when they do, it stacks a debuff on everyone in the raid, which slowly builds up to 100, and at 100 stacks, you become petrified, so you can't move, you can't act, you're basically dead. You can't be revived, it's, you're fucked. And also, while those stacks are building on you, your movement speed is slowly being reduced. But when a boss is stacking Petrify on you, you then take 90% less damage from that boss's element. Now there's nothing we can do to stop one of the bosses from casting Petrification, it's just going to happen. It's random which boss uses it, but it is going to get cast, and it is going to start stacking on us. Obviously it's quite important that we get those stacks off, and that's when the 4th attack comes into play that they all share. So, this 4th move is called Overload, and much like Petrification, it kind of varies depending on which boss is using it. So if the Jade Guardian is casting it, it's Jade Overload, or Jasper Overload, and so on. And this will get cast by any boss that reaches 100 energy. And like I said, energy will build for any boss that's within 12 yards of another boss, and that's at a rate of around 1.5 energy per second. Overload does 2 things, the first of which is cause a metric fuck ton of damage to the entire raid. But the good news there is, if we've got the Petrify stacks of the same element as the Overload, we take 90% less of that damage, so it becomes a fraction of a fuck ton. The second thing that Overload does is it drops all stacks of Petrification of that element, so Jade or Amethyst. So let's say we've got the Amethyst Guardian casting Petrification on the raid, but we let the Jade Guardian Overload. That will not drop the Amethyst Petrification stacks, so we're still going to end up turning to stone and wiping. Assuming of course that we even survive the Overload, because at that point we wouldn't have the right stacks of Petrify to nullify it. And that's really the key feature of this fight, is correctly managing overloads. We need to make sure that the boss that's casting Petrification on us is the boss that overloads, because that then drops all our stacks. And at that point a different boss will start casting Petrification, and we start over. In a second we'll look at how to do that, but for now I'll quickly run through the individual abilities of each boss. And these are kind of added just to make the fight interesting for DPS, seeing as the mechanics I've already explained are mostly for the tanks and the healers to focus on. So, Amethyst Guardian. This guy has an ability called Amethyst Pool, which basically creates a void zone or a little patch of fire, which inflicts 60k plus 4.2% of spell power damage to any mug thick enough to stand in it. So in the words of every WoW player anywhere ever, get out of the fire. The Jade Guardian will cast Jade Shards, which is basically a raid-wide AoE attack. It will hit you no matter where you are for about 30k, and that's cast, give or take, every 10 seconds or so. The Jasper Guardian's an annoying bastard because he casts Jasper Chains, and that's kind of like the Blood Queen Lanathel encounter in Icecrown Citadel, in which two players are linked together. You'll see it on your UI, there'll be a chain linking you to a different player, and for every second that you remain more than 15 yards apart, you take damage, and each second that you're apart, the damage that you take increases. So when you see yourself getting chained to a different player, make sure you get up to them and hug them. And finally we have the Cobalt Guardian, who's arguably the most dangerous of the four. He casts Cobalt Mine, which is a projectile fired at a random player, and when it lands, after 3 seconds it becomes active, and that means that anyone within 7 yards of it causes a blow up, and that deals roughly 100k damage to anyone within 7 yards of the mine, and it also roots them in place for 6 seconds, so that can be a bit nasty. And that means that everyone's got to stay awake, so if you see a shard coming towards you, get out of the way, and that includes tanks and healers. Okay, so that's what we're up against. Now let's look at the environment we're fighting in. Here's a shit picture of the room we fight the bosses in. As you can see, it's helpfully split in two by a lovely rug, and that rug's useful because for this fight we'll have 2 tanks, one on each side of the room. Before the fight starts, I'll put raid markers up here, and that's where our main tank and off tank will stand. Everyone else should clump around the main tank. Obviously, as the bosses use various attacks and void zones fill up on the floor and mines and chains and whatnot, we'll need to move around a bit, but mostly stack around the tank. It makes it easier for healers to AoE heal. The tanks are really going to be the heroes in this fight. Sorry healers, but they really are. At the start of the fight, the main tank will pull 2 of the 3 bosses. The off tank pulls the 3rd. For the pull itself, it might be helpful to have a hunter or a rogue use misdirection or tricks of the trade to ensure that the second boss does go for the right tank. So, post-pull, this is how it will look. The main tank will have 2 bosses on him on the left-hand side of the rug, whereas the off tank is just holding the 3rd one on the right. Now because the off tank's boss has Stone Skin active at this point, it will take next to no damage, but it will also generate no energy, so there's no worry about him overloading. But because the main tank's bosses will both be generating energy, because they're so close together, there is a risk that eventually one of those 2 is going to overload. 5 seconds after the pull, the first boss, which is random, will start to cast Petrification. Best case scenario, it's one of the 2 that the main tank is holding, but it is possible that the off tank boss will be the one that starts to cast it. If that is the case, the main tank needs to taunt the off tank's boss as quickly as possible, while at the same time the off tank needs to taunt one of the main tank's 2 bosses, so a tank swap. The goal is to make sure that the boss that we need to overload, which is the one casting Petrification, is gaining energy. Of course, since energy will be stacking for 2 bosses rather than just the one, an overload could be possible for the wrong boss. So to make sure it doesn't happen, as the boss we need to overload starts to get close, around 50 energy, the tanks should perform another taunt swap. So the boss that has energy that we don't want to overload is replaced by a fresh boss that has little energy, so the first boss to overload will be the correct one. So assuming that all goes well, the first boss to overload is the one that's casting Petrification on the raid, so when it overloads it wipes off all stacks of Petrify. If it goes wrong, however, we might get hit by an overload from the wrong boss, which would be bad, because we won't have the damage reduction debuff, which is part of Petrification. The raid will take a hell of a lot of damage, but while that is bad, it is healable. We can get through it if we need to. On the other hand, if we royally fuck it up and we allow both bosses that aren't casting Petrification to overload, that would be really very bad indeed. Honestly, I can't explain just how bad it would actually be. It would be 2 back-to-back overloads that would cause around 500k damage across the raid, which is quite likely to be a wipe. But, assuming our tanks are on the ball, and the taunting goes well, and the correct target overloads, we then have a 5-second window before the next target randomly chosen begins to cast Petrification. Once the next boss does begin casting it, the tanks once again need to coordinate themselves so that they have the boss that needs to overload and a second boss with low energy on the same side, so they both begin to build energy. From then on, it's just a case of DPS continuing to nuke the 2 bosses while the tanks continue to taunt swap when necessary. Speaking of DPS, I mentioned earlier that it's a good idea for DPS to cleave on the bosses. Now obviously it's not worth attacking the boss that has Stone Skin, that's pretty much pointless because it's taking 90% less damage. But the 2 bosses that are gaining energy, they're fair game, so if you can hit 2 targets at once, do it. Unless of course your single target attacks can hit for more than twice the damage that your cleave can do to a single target. It's also a smart move to dot as many targets as you can. Since the bosses share a health pool, you're basically applying multiple dots to the same target, which means a much faster kill. Well, those are the Stone Guard tactics. To recap, DPS should stack around the main tank and dot and cleave as many targets as they can. Whichever boss is casting Petrification should be the one that you allow to overload. Tanks should communicate clearly over Ventrilo or Mumble or Skype or whatever you use to ensure that tank swaps are carried out accurately and quickly. All raiders should be avoiding the void zones and the mines, and moving close together if they're affected by chains. And that concludes this guide. Thanks for watching, I hope you found it useful. Looking forward to raiding in Pandaria with you guys.